Now in this section of the tutorial we're going to be working with Z-sphere chains and connector meshes. And just to make sure it's absolutely clear, I'm going to insert a little mini tutorial here where we talk about the process of creating a Z-sphere chain, because I just want to make sure that everybody watching knows how to do this. Under the tool menu you're going to select a Z-sphere, draw it on the canvas, and then go into edit mode. Make sure X symmetry is turned on. Now I'm going to draw one sphere on the top, rotate around to the bottom, and I'll draw another sphere on the bottom. So what I end up with a root sphere here in the center, and then I've got my two child spheres on either side. This is a Z-sphere chain in its most basic form. We're going to create a Z-sphere chain that runs down the spine of our character, and from that we're going to grow out Z-sphere chains to represent scorpion tails. It's going to have 6 scorpion tails with stingers on the end. And we're using Z-spheres to create this because it's a very quick way of generating a mesh that lends itself to making, long appendages like this. It's a little bit better than maybe trying to do it with Dynamesh, because then you have to pull out long noodles and things, or if you're using the tube brushes, you're creating long tubes, and it's a little bit harder to get the nice jointed, segmented quality. And there's another reason we're going to use Z-spheres as well, is because we're able to use connector meshes, which I'll show you in just a moment. If I want to preview the mesh that's being created, I press the A hotkey, A as an apple, and it shows me the mesh that will be created from the Z-sphere chain. Now, if I select my root sphere here, I'm going to go to the light box, and I'm going to need to load up a polysphere, just so I've got a polysphere loaded into the tool menu. I'll come back to my Z-sphere chain, and then under Adaptive Skin, if I turn on Use Classic Skinning, I get these two options here, use Insert Local Mesh and Insert Connector Mesh. If I select the joint between the root and the child sphere, turn on Classic Skinning, and then click Insert Connector Mesh, I can now select any polygon object and use that as a connector mesh. So what that will do is, if I use the polysphere here, it replaces the connection between those two spheres with the sphere. Let's say I want to use a cylinder instead. I come up here to the Cylinder 3D. Let's make this a polymesh. Come back down to my Z-sphere chain, and that joint is still selected. So if I go to Adaptive Skin, turn on Classic Skinning, Insert Connector Mesh, and I'll select that cylinder. Now you can see I get a cylinder as my connector mesh. Now that connector mesh is recalled, so if I draw two more spheres, two more child spheres, you'll see that those connector meshes are also turned into cylinders. Draw another one. There we go. But you see there's nothing in there for the spheres themselves. What I need to do is select my root sphere and then insert a local mesh, and I'll insert the polysphere for the local mesh. Now you see each child sphere has now been replaced with a polysphere. So I've got really nice jointing happening here. I've got cylinders connecting little spheres. So you can see how it sort of gives the impression of, or it starts to suggest a jointed sort of insectoid tail or insectoid structure. If I preview my mesh, you see it gives me this nice jointed pipe quality. That's how connector meshes and local meshes work. Now, I'll pre-warn you that what happens here in the tutorial is we build our Z-sphere chain using some basic connector meshes, but later on I decide to get a little bit more advanced with it, and we're going to go in and instead of using cylinder as our connector mesh, we're going to sculpt just a single sort of exoskeletal joint and then use that as a connector mesh. So we're going to end up replacing these very basic primitive connector meshes with something we've custom sculpted to represent segments of an insectoid stinger tail. So it's going to be pretty cool when we go in and do that, but I think it's important that we do this really basic approach to begin with so you understand how Z-sphere chains and connector meshes work. So again, just to recap really quickly, here we've got our basic Z-sphere chain, root sphere in the center, child spheres on either end. I go into Move mode and select a connector between two spheres, turn on Classic Skinning, and then click Insert Connector Mesh, and I'm going to select the cylinder. Now, if I draw, I end up getting these connectors automatically. If I want meshes on each sphere, I need to select the root sphere, click insert local mesh and select the polysphere. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump back into the play-by-play work in progress, and let's look at creating the spine and the tails for this character. So the first thing we'll do, we'll append a Z-sphere into our subtool stack. I'm going to go ahead and create a Z-sphere chain like we just did. We'll scale it down a little bit and try and line it up about where the spinal cord is going to fall on the character. Make sure our X symmetry is turned on. Now with the root Z-sphere selected here, I come down and turn on Use Classic Skinning. And if I select a local mesh here, I'm selecting the sphere. I'll select the joint between them and select a connector mesh, and in this case I'm going to select the cylinder. So I've got the cylinder now established as my connector mesh. I'll draw another child sphere, and you can see that it's replaced that sphere with the polysphere, the local mesh polysphere, and now I have selected the connector and then added a cylinder as my connector mesh. So now just going into transparency mode, I'm going to shift this Z-sphere chain into position. I'm just clicking and dragging the individual Z-spheres from the side view. Now previewing the mesh with the A hotkey, you can see how the connectors are working. You can see I'm missing a few here. I'm going to select this joint and insert a connector mesh and select the cylinder. And again here. There you can see the resulting, almost looks like pipe work. And the idea is just to give myself a nice segmented mesh that has polygroups already. That's another nice thing about this. Just like any other Z-sphere chain, those parts are going to be polygrouped to make it much easier to sculpt them independently of each other and create a segmented quality. So at this stage we'll start to grow the child spheres out on either side to start creating these tails. There'll be about 6 tails that I want to grow out of the back of the character. I don't want to do too many more than that because then it starts to get a bit busy and difficult to compose the image. I don't want to overpower the character with too many things sprouting out of its back. Now at this stage I decided to replace the cylinders with spheres, because I feel like that's going to give me a more organic shape to sculpt the segmented insect parts from. But again, I'll stress that later on I decided to just replace these connector meshes with a custom sculpted exoskeletal connector that's made specifically for the tail. The logic being that since I know each segment is going to be more or less the same, I might as well sculpt one of them and then use that as my connector mesh instead of having to go sculpt each one of these segments. But again, it's a valuable lesson now to see how we can go in and individually select connectors and then replace them with new connector meshes. All we need to do is select the joint between two spheres and then go to our insert connector mesh and just select a different polygon object. At this stage, I'm just using the standard rotate to pose the stinger or the stinger chains, give it a very nice imposing quality that sort of complements the springing or the springy kind of quality of the pose, where it really feels like he's about to lunge into action. Now at this stage I'm extending that base sphere down with the intention of sculpting some kind of extension to the body, because I realized that when I compose this for my final image, I don't want to cut him off at the pelvis without there being anything there. I'm not quite sure how I want to resolve the rest of the body yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and add some geometry down there with the expectation that I'll sculpt something from it later. I just want to make sure that I've got something there to support some sculpting, because I did end at the pelvis, and I'm thinking now there might be a longer segmented body down there, as if it's the end of a large centipede or a large segmented worm. Now at this stage I'm going to do a little bit of adjustment to the pose of the character, using the move brush just to make some changes to the size of the rib cage and the proportions between the parts. Now time-lapse this just to speed up the process a little bit and make it a little more interesting to watch. I'm using masking now to mask again these segmented plates so I can pull these out further and overlap them just to add a whole lot more level of detail down there in the lower abdomen. Adjusting the gesture of the neck. I really want this character to feel like it's lunging forward more, so I'm going to rotate the body relative to the head to give more of a forward thrust. So I'm just trying to get a good feel for which one works the best. And when I do that, it's going to throw those Z-sphere chains out of alignment with the back. Since I'm composing this for a still image, this is a character design, and I don't really have to resolve the back unless there needs to be a back view. I don't worry at this point about how those pieces are going to attach back there. I let them sit and approximate where they'll terminate into the body. And then if there were a job situation, and I would work on it so it looked as good as possible from the front view, and I had an idea of how things are working in the back, I wouldn't want to just fly blind. But I probably wouldn't resolve all the sculpture on the back just to save time. And if it turns out the design is met with positive review, then I would go in and further refine the back and make sure it's really clear how everything's connecting. And then I can render and paint a back view. But typically these things need to be done as soon as possible to get as many ideas out as possible. So usually I try and err on the side of sculpting what needs to be seen for a particular view to sell a character in sort of a particular attitude or particular environment. So here I'm still using my transpose tools to adjust that pose to make it feel a little bit more malicious. I want to give it a forward thrust and a sense of malicious intent, so it feels like a more intimidating character. At this stage I'm going to use the tubes, or the curved tube brush, to create those tendrils on the back of the head. I want something that's suggestive of tentacles or hair or feelers. I want to give some nice falls of very thick, drapey bits of tissue back there. Partially it's to subconsciously suggest hair, but also just to break up the silhouette in that area, because I've already got an idea of how I'm going to be composing my image in 3/4 view. So I want that negative space between the back of the head and the stinger appendages. I want that to be filled. Like you can see there, that negative space there gets filled with those tendrils falling off the back of the head, like real long, thick chunks of hair. Subconsciously, that would be what it's suggestive of. And it's also just a really skin-crawly, nasty addition to this creature, which is already quite insectoid and chthonic. Something you find under a rock, under a very big rock. And it doesn't seem friendly. So I'm just adding as many of these little tendrils as I can get in there. I want it to be a real mass, a real massy mess. There we go. We've now executed a Dynamesh, and we can smooth back some of these the connectors between the tendrils and the skin itself and the head itself. Use the move brush to shift them around a little bit. Now using the curved tube brush, or the curve brush, to add some more sort of veining and cordage happening through the neck there. Adding some more tendrils along the back. Just really kind of going crazy with these. I want to really fill out the back of the head with a whole lot of mass of these tentacles. And remember that you can shift the end points and move them around. You can also adjust the curve, and if you want to adjust the size of the tube itself, just change your draw size and click one endpoint, and it will update the diameter of the tube. So we're executing a Dynamesh now to blend all of those into a single volume. And now switching over to the move brush, I'm going to start adjusting just the overall shapes. Again, adjusting the barrel of the chest. Thinking about the gesture at this point. Try and fix some of these problems in the upper arm. Straighten up that arm that was getting a bit bent in a strange way. And building up with the clay tubes brush. I'm going to go into a higher time lapse at this point, since it's pretty self-explanatory as I work that I'm using my brushes, my standard, my clay tubes and move brush to adjust the surface. So I'm going to go ahead and increase my time lapse just so we can see a bit more happening. So I'm masking out the pectoralis muscle so I can work on the deltoid independently. Then I'll invert that mask and then work on the pectoralis itself and tuck it up under that deltoid muscle. And then I'll execute another Dynamesh to correct any of those areas that got a little bit kinked under there. And then continue to stroke with the clay tubes brush to try and bring the fanning of that pectoralis muscle out from the upper arm, from the humerus bone. Then we will revisit the standard brush, and what I'm doing here is just trying to create some interesting striations along the surface of the carapace of the torso. I'm starting to try and pinch and create some hard edges here because I do want the body of this character to be a bit of a hybrid between areas of hard shell and areas of fleshiness. I don't want it to look necessarily mechanical. I want it to retain a certain organic quality, much in the same way that, for example, a crab shell does, but it still has a structural quality that is very obviously rigid. So building up some of these panels here, these armor plates, using the clay tubes brush for this just to mask these out. And with the standard brush, I'll etch in some recessed areas in between the ribs, picking out little areas of shadow to add some more visual interest in these areas. And now I'm using the trim dynamic brush to start to add subplanes, just to break up some facets in here and create something that feels less organic in terms of the shaping and a little bit more manufactured almost, but still it's part of an organic creature, so it's biomechanical would be the best thing to call it. And I'm just using the standard brush to add some veining and some cordage up along the neck here. I want to suggest organic connectivity between the shoulders and the head. And the way I work, like I said, as I move around a lot, I'm already popped back down to the abdomen here, and I'm working on some more plates. I think the best way to describe the reason why I do that is because it just keeps the whole experience fresh, and it keeps me interested as I'm going. It keeps me from overworking in any one sort of particular area. Whereas if I were to if I were to work just on one area for an hour, it would become overworked and out of balance with the rest of the character. And I'm adjusting the lights now. I'm doing a little test render. I just want to see how these things are going to read under the BPR render. Every once in a while I will do just a quick test render just to see if my shapes are overstated or understated and how things look once they've got some more accurate light and shadow on them. Because the light and shadow you see while you're sculpting really is a preview. It's not a calculated render. And again, I'm just picking out areas of light and shadow here on the head. I'm adding little pits and wrinkles and trying to create a sense of detail. Pulling out little spikes in the mandibles so it feels like it's got a biting surface in there. And even though this is time-lapse, it's double speed right now. You can see even, if this were regular speed, I would definitely be moving around rather quickly, kind of popping from area to area. And I encourage you to relax and step back and do the same thing. Don't really obsess over one area of your sculpture. Just work the whole thing at one time, moving around it, and just enjoy the process. Just let it grow organically, all at the same time. And I think you'll find that you get lost in the process that way, and it becomes more enjoyable. And I think the whole sculpture feels more unified at the end of the day. I'm using the tube brush now, the not clay tubes, excuse me, the curve tube brush to add more little tendrily vein details on the character here. Now at this stage I'm using the curved tube brush to add these little tendril spikes coming off the sides. And the reason for that is I feel like it helps create, or it helps accentuate that backwards triangle that's being created by the elbows, the momentum of the character, or the composition of the character arching itself back, so you've got action pushing back as if it's about to spring. And those lines just, they felt right to go in that area, just to accentuate that sense of movement. I'm going to build up little puckers around them as if they're coming out of the skin, or there's little cavities from which they're growing. Usually when I'm adding things, I'm trying to think of why I'm adding that particular element. Every once in a while I'll just put something on just to see how it looks, but usually I've got a reason for putting it there, like those little tendril spikes in the back of the head and along the back of the rib cage. Those are there to help fill in a negative space, and they're serving an actual, premeditated purpose in the design. That is to fill out the negative space behind the head and suggest hair without being hair. And those pieces on the sides of the body just to help fill out that negative space, or break up that negative space and make it more interesting between the arm and the torso. And also to accentuate the movement that's implied by the sculpture. Just adjusting the anatomy of the arm, trying to make it feel a little bit more solid, like there's a joint in there, like there's bone underneath and muscle on top. And then stretching skin across the forearm, just by adding a few little raised wrinkles. Now returning to the abdomen plates and adding more details. Again, just using the standard brush. Now at this point I've turned off my Dynamesh. The reason for that is I feel like I've done everything I'm going to do with Dynamesh, and I want to add another subdivision level. So I turned off Dynamesh, and now I'm just a regular subdivision sculpture, a regular Z tool. Now I've added a subdivision level. You can see I've got 2 now, and this is allowing me to add a finer level of detail. I can sharpen up some of these edges and start to go in and add a finer level of bump and valley and wrinkle. And this is where I really start getting excited about sculpting in fine lines and tying things together. Adding these little wrinkles along this abdomen form. It's become sort of a poison sac sort of construct in the final sculpture. It looks like it's a fluid-filled sac in the final painting. So it's fun to put these little wrinkles in there and suggest functions that these parts may have, and just make them interesting and make them all fit together in a neat way. And one bit of advice that I'll give is don't overdo your subdivision levels. I always tell people to try and get as much detail as possible out of the lowest possible subdivision level. So I've only added 1 sub-D now, so we've got 2 levels here. And that's allowing me to create the level of detail that I want without my brushes becoming overwhelmed by all the geometry. If this was subdivided up too high, it would just slow down the interactivity, and I wouldn't be getting anything extra out of it. It would just be slowing things down. Whereas this is just enough where I can pop in these little raised venting areas that I'm doing here along the center of the torso, and I can pop in the little hollows and add fine wrinkles, and they look good. They're exactly the level of detail that I'm looking for at this stage. If I were to add in pore level detail, I might add 1 more subdivision level, but I'm not there yet. Right now this is really serving the purpose that I need. So don't be in too much of a hurry to subdivide too high too soon. Subdivide and make sure that you can't just get what you need out of that particular subdivision level before you start adding more. And I'm using a mask here to create a little raised plate that's winging out from the surface. I can't stress how important masks are to my sculpting technique. I use them a lot, and I think you can get a whole lot of really neat effects by using masking and saving our work. Okay, at this stage I've decided that I want to replace my connector meshes in those stinger tails with a different mesh that's specifically sculpted. So I'm selecting the polysphere, and I'm going to create just a single piece of a segmented scorpion tail-like structure. I just want it to look like an exoskeletal link in a chain, and I'm going to use that as my connector mesh, and that's going to replace all of those elongated spheres that we've got in there now, and it's going to save me the trouble of having to sculpt each one of those links. I can just sculpt one, use it as a connector mesh, and then subtly change each one along the length of the stinger tail. So I'm just going along in here and adjusting my shape. I'm just sculpting it as you would any other Z tool. It's just a polysphere. I'm going in with my standard brush and adding some ridges along the sides. So I've increased the speed on this clip now, just so we can watch the sculpting happen in a little more time lapse. And I'm just adding sort of segmented plated detail to the back here, just etching in those recessed lines, and now adding a subdivision level so I can make all this detail sharper. And I just want this to look like the back of an insect, like maybe the back of one of those Trinidadian cockroaches. They have the nice plating along their backs, and it's really kind of disturbing to look at. So here I'm using the mask to mask out each plate, and using the move brush to pull it up and tuck it over the next. So this helps me create a really nice sharp line of delineation between each plate just by using masking there. And remember, if you Control-Alt-Click on the mask, it'll sharpen the edge, give you an even sharper line before you use the move brush to pull it out. And just running a stroke with the standard brush along the edge, just to give it a little bit more of a shadow. Now I'm selecting this wrinkle alpha and just dragging sort of striations down the length of the plate, just to make it seem like it's a little bit more weathered. and then going in a drag rectangle stroke and adding these little bumpy details using this bump alpha. These are all just standard alphas in ZBrush. This is nothing special or imported. Just for these pieces, this small, I think it's fine to use these default alphas. Usually I try and use custom alphas that don't come by default with ZBrush. I only rarely use the default ones for very specific things, but here I think they work just fine. But you're welcome to create your own or use your own alphas to detail your particular piece however you like. Once we've completed this, we're going to use this Z tool as a connector mesh. We're just going to replace the spheres in that Z-sphere chain for the stinger arms. We're going to replace those connector meshes with this. And this saves us the trouble of having to go in and sculpt each individual link in that chain. So we're saving our work now. And when we import this in as a connector mesh, the orientation may be wrong, so we'll just have to check and see how it looks when we bring it in. And if it's oriented incorrectly, we'll just go back to the original Z tool and change its orientation. So I select my Z-sphere chain, and I'll go in here and I'll select one of the connector meshes. We'll go down real close to the root sphere. Just select the move brush and then select one of the connectors. Make sure you're not in draw mode because that'll just draw a new sphere. Go to adaptive skin, insert connector mesh, and then I will select from the tool menu. There we go, we'll select that joint that we created. And there you can see it's replaced it, but it's stretching it in the wrong way because the orientation is wrong. So I have to go back to my original sculpture, and then under the tool menu there's a preview window, and this is where I can set my orientation. There is the current orientation, so I will flip it over and then click store, and that changes the orientation of the Z tool. So now when we import it in as a connector mesh, the hope is the orientation will be correct, but we might have to revisit it and just change it one more time just to see how it comes in. So we'll come down to adaptive skin and insert connector mesh, select the plate, and it comes in correctly. There you can see it's now oriented correctly. And it also stretches along the length of that connector, and it actually looks quite cool, works rather nicely. And because the resulting mesh will all be polygrouped, we'll be able to use the move brush with polygroup masking on to manipulate each one of these segments. So I think that looks quite cool. So I'm coming back here now, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to reduce the size of these big circles here. I feel like these are probably too deep, so I'm going to use the clay brush to fill these out, because on the underside of the stinger tail, these big hollow areas just really aren't working for me. And we'll just widen this so it's not quite as tapered. Just make a few little adjustments to it, just based on how it looks once we import it in as a connector mesh. We can come back and make changes, then return to our Z-sphere chain just by selecting that Z tool. And then popping down to the insert connector mesh here, we'll select that connector mesh, or we'll select that connector, and then come down to adaptive skin, insert connector mesh, and then re-import our Z tool. And you'll see that it updates now, it no longer has those hollow sections on the underside. So I'll select each connector as I go along and replace it with my Z tool. Just click insert connector mesh and then select our sculpted piece. Now you can see that what's happening here is the back of the plate is actually facing forward. That's because of the rotation of the Z-sphere chain. You can't really tell the rotation of the Z-sphere chain unless you're looking at the two shades of red, but it's not always very clear which way it's oriented. Now that we've got, you know, a directional kind of Z-tool object on here, it's pretty clear that the back of the insect plates are facing the wrong way. So what I'm doing is I'm clicking on the Z-spheres and then rotating them in rotate mode. Just by clicking and dragging, I'm rotating these around so the plates are facing the correct direction. They'll be facing towards the back. I'm just trying to orient these. So I'll come down here and select the base, the very bottom Z-sphere for that chain, and then I'll rotate everything. That rotates everything above it. When you want to rotate the entire length of the chain, you need to hold down Alt while you click and drag to rotate the sphere. So as you see me rotating the entire chain by rotating the base sphere, I'm clicking Alt. I'm holding down the Alt key while I click and drag, and that rotates all of the spheres along the length of that chain. If you were to just click and drag, then it would actually rotate the appendage as if it were a joint. You'll notice that I'm also scaling here. Now the way I'm scaling is very similar. You click and drag when you're in scale mode, that's E for scale mode, on the root sphere, or on the base sphere of that chain, and while you're holding down Alt, it'll scale all of the spheres along that chain. So click and drag while you're holding Alt, and if you're rotating, it'll rotate all the spheres, and if you're scaling, it will scale all the spheres. So I'm doing the same thing with the connector meshes now on the upper set of stinger tails, just replacing each connector mesh with my sculpted segment. And here again, I click, hold down Alt, and drag while I'm in rotate mode on that base sphere, and it will rotate the entire chain. And then I can go back in and rotate the other pieces individually just by clicking and dragging on the individual spheres to rotate. Now you can click and drag on a sphere, or you can click and drag on the joint between the sphere, and the method of rotation will be different for each. If you want to bend the joints as if they are appendages, just click and drag the connectors between the spheres while you're in rotate mode, and it will bend them. So now I've got the adaptive skin loaded as a subtool. To do that, all you need to do is go to the Adaptive Skin menu and click Make Adaptive Skin, and then append that tool into your subtool stack. I'm using the Move brush with polygroup masking turned on so I can work each individual segment on its own. And I'm just trying to make sure these mesh together nicely and overlap so they feel like they're jointed pieces. And just add a little bit of nuance using the Move brush. So now I'm going to use the masking brush just to mask out a few dots here, and I'm going to pull sort of spikes out from here. Smaller spikes along the sides. invert that mask and then use the move brush just to pull these little spikes, these little teeth out. So I want it to look like a really nasty stinger head that has smaller little barbs to catch flesh, and then we'll add a much larger stinger in the center. So it just gives it a very nasty appearance. I'm just using the move brush just to pull these out and give them some curvature. And add some more spikes along the sides. It's got a real nasty look to it. Now coming in and doing some detailing around the eye area, just to add some wrinkles. Just so basically I want to give the sense of, nice leathery skin around the eye, which will be an interesting contrast to the exoskeletal appearance at the top of the head. Give some nice fleshiness around the eye, and we've got those nice fleshy tendrils at the base of the skull. So it creates a very disturbing character. Very disturbing contrast of form for the character. So here we are after a fair bit more detailing, mainly with the standard brush, and we can see our final character. Now I've added a few more bits here. I'm going to go into my subtool menu and I'm going to turn on some spheres that I've added for eyeballs and for the top of the head. And these are just polyspheres that have been imported in and duplicated using the same control click and drag technique with the transpose move brush. I'm going to turn on my inner pedipalps there for the mouth. You can see I've added a little bit of detail in here, and it's mainly all just with the standard brush. This Z tool will be available for you. This bottom portion here, I just duplicated the waist and then dragged it down 3 times. It's just 3 duplicates of the same waist that you already saw. I just wanted to create something to fill out the bottom of the character because I knew that my final render would be from approximately this view. Let me turn my stinger arms on here. So knowing that this would be the angle that I would be rendering it from, I knew that I wanted something to fill out the lower portion of the frame, otherwise the character would just end before the bottom of the frame, and that just wouldn't make for good composition. And here you can see that we've used the move brush to pull some stingers out of the ends of the tails here. It's the exact same way we did the smaller spikes. And we've done the same thing for the fingers, creating some nice big stinger spikes on the end of the fingers, some nice claws there. So there we go. That completes this tutorial. We've used Dynamesh to build a character from basic parts like spheres, as well as kit bashing pieces from other models like arms and eyes to create an entirely new character. Here I just want to show you the final grayscale render. This is done with BPR. And then here we have a paint over of the same character. And this is all accomplished using Photoshop paint over techniques. Same things that I discuss in my book ZBrush Creature Design. It was just recently published by Cybex. It's mainly Photoshop overlays, and I will also include that Photoshop file for you to take a look at as well. So I hope you enjoyed watching this tutorial as much as I enjoyed creating it. I had a lot of fun making this character, and I hope that you're going to be able to take these techniques and use them in your own work. Dynamesh is an incredibly powerful tool. It's allowed us to create this entirely new complex character from very basic building blocks such as spheres, as well as kit bashing parts from existing models. So this is going to really blow open the doors to creating a lot of new characters and a lot of interesting shapes that you might not have been able to create very easily before. So thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always available. My email address is scott@scottspencer.com. And thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.